Hey friends, there is a lot of yapping on the internet about ultra-processed foods right now. And it's funny or awful, depending on your current mood, that with all the dietary infighting online between the carnivores and the plant eaters, pretty much the only thing that everyone can agree on is to avoid ultra-processed foods. But are all ultra-processed foods bad for you? And how bad? And what about the folks who tell you to avoid processed foods but sell greens powders? Aren't those ultra processed too? We're going to talk about all of this and more on this solo episode of the Allsorts podcast with me, your friendly internet dietitian, Desiree Nielsen. I started the Allsorts podcast to create space for nuanced, evidence informed conversations about health and wellness in all its forms. Whether you want to explore getting back to nature, creating a happier, healthier home, or finally understand why people talk about the Mediterranean diet so much, we've got episodes on all of those topics and more in our archives. And if you're new to my solo episodes, fair warning, they are kind of nerdy. We are going to dive deep into the science behind ultra processed foods, including how we decide what an ultra processed food is and isn't. But we always bring it back around to a very practical, usable, what the heck do I do at the grocery store kind of advice in the end. We'll start, as we always do, with a few of the things I'm loving right now before we go deep on UPFs, as you're going to hear me call them, and we'll close with a community question. Want the chance to weigh in on community questions and the topics I choose for these solos? Be sure you're following at the Allsorts Pod on Instagram. And before we get going, I want to let you know that we will be talking a bit about more sensitive topics such as obesity. So if that's not a fit for you, go ahead and press pause and we'll catch you on the next episode. Okay? Let's dive in. First up, the things I am very, very into right now, starting with Superbelly. I'm in a very unusual for me phase where I'm having a hard time getting myself to drink a lot of plain water. And I usually drink a lot of water. I'm maybe getting like a third of my water plain and then drinking the rest as teas and Superbelly, which is this powdered drink mix from Bloom that contains just a little bit of sodium for electrolytes, as well as a small dose of prebiotics and probiotics. Not so much that it angers my IBS. And also, so if I want, I could have more than one a day. My favorite flavor is the hibiscus. And if you want to try it, Bloom, which is a Canadian woman of color owned company, gave me a discount code for you, which is just my name, DESIREE. This is not a sponsored ad. I'm just wanting to support a local company I really love and have been using for years. Number 2 on my list, gardening. It's the start of garden season here, and I've been so incredibly happy getting out into the dirt again. I cannot tell you how much less stressed and more content I feel when I'm doing garden work. Now, I do have a little bit of garden space, and I get that if you don't have much outdoor space, let me tell you that you can absolutely have this same experience with houseplants, some windowsill herbs, or some pots on your deck. If you can, I highly recommend it. And if you need more inspiration, check out my recent episode on the healing power of nature with Jessica Mernan on the pod. Also, do yourself a favor and search modern cottage gardens on Pinterest and just watch your blood pressure drop. Okay? Finally, I don't know if I've ever talked to you about Uniqlo. Yes, the Japanese clothing basics company. I've been shopping there since I spent some time in Japan as a teenager. And when they finally came to Canada, I was so happy. They make really high quality basics that are affordable and will actually last you a long time, like their cotton t-shirts. And I don't have a huge clothing budget, so a lot of my day-to-day basics are actually from Uniqlo. But what really set me off and wanting to share this was that it's really hard to find stylish vegan shoes that aren't expensive. And as part of their Uniqlo C line, they're starting to make some cute ones. I got this lug sole loafer last year that still looks great, and I bought a puffy slide this spring. Super into them. Okay, now that we've warmed up with some fun stuff, let's get seriously nerdy. I don't think we can have a robust conversation about ultra-processed foods until we define what they actually are, which is maybe by starting with what they're not. First things first. Every food you encounter in the grocery store is processed. Unless you picked it yourself out of the ground, it's been processed. Those baby greens have been washed, albeit not always well enough. Please wash them. No one wants to get E. coli. Beans have been cooked and canned. Spices have been irradiated so they don't cause food poisoning. That's pretty important. So, processing in and of itself is not the concern. It makes our food supply safer and improves the lifespan of health staples. Canned beans are practically a superfood. They've just been cleaned and cooked and made shelf stable. Almonds are packed with nutrition and they're also pasteurized so that their naturally occurring microbes, because they end up on the ground during harvesting, don't overgrow on the shelf and make us sick. The line in the sand between processing and ultra processing, in a nutshell, it's about transforming the food a few too many degrees away from its original state. So, a protein chip made from chicken, that's an ultra processed food, sorry to break it to you, just like a Cheeto or a root beer. But also, so is a greens powder. Yes, I am looking at you, AG1. Already, you might have noticed, I think there's a little more nuance to the ultra processed food story than the internet would have you believe. But let's be scientific about it. Let's be curious. How are ultra processed foods defined? What makes them different from like the cold pressed juices, the rice, and the chickpeas all us wellness folks know and love? More often than not, health professionals and researchers rely on a set of criteria developed in Brazil known as the NOVA classification system for their definition of ultra processed foods. The purpose of the NOVA classification is stated as classifying all foods according to the nature, extent, and purposes of the industrial processes they undergo. What does that mean? The criteria are as follows. NOVA classifies foods into one of four groups. NOVA 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed foods, essentially taken straight from the earth and perhaps shelled or dried, like carrots or almonds. NOVA 2 includes culinary ingredients like oils, salt, or spices that come from NOVA 1 foods. NOVA 3 is where the processed foods like canned beans, fresh baked goods, or cured meats made from NOVA 1 and NOVA 2 foods live. And then the one we're all here to debate, NOVA 4, the ultra processed foods made from primarily, and I quote, substances derived from foods and additives with little, if any, intact NOVA 1 food. So, by this definition, old fashioned oats are NOVA 1 because they're minimally processed as they're steamed and rolled, but there's like no other ingredients added or taken away. By contrast, oat milk is ultra processed because the oats are transformed beyond their original form via industrial processing, and there are added ingredients such as emulsifiers that would not normally be found in a kitchen. But the NOVA system itself is prone to some issues because it's pretty subjective. I mean, it might not have sounded that subjective, but in practice, it is. And I came across this 2022 paper in the journal Nature that found that even nutrition professionals had a hard time assigning foods to one of the four categories. In their study, there was a lack of consistency in the category these professionals assigned to these foods. And these professionals included dietitians and nutrition researchers. And NOVA does not account for the nutritional quality of food. And this should be like a little bit of a, I don't know, like a yellow flag. It doesn't account for nutritional quality at all. It simply classifies based on the degree of processing. So, like I said, a Cheeto and a pea protein powder are both NOVA 4, even though they have very different nutritional attributes. So now that we know exactly what we mean when we say ultra processed foods, which I will, as I mentioned, call UPFs, the question becomes, how big of an issue are they for our health? In the research, it's pretty well established that we are consuming more ultra processed foods than ever before. It's estimated that 54% of the calories consumed by the average American comes from ultra processed foods. In Canada, 2018 research, the last and nearest year that we have data for, suggests an estimate of 45%. But I feel fairly confident that we're consuming more UPFs than in 2018, not less. And if you're wondering about any of the research that I cite, as always, it's included in my show notes so you can get direct links to the studies I'm talking about. So we do know that we are actually eating a lot of ultra processed foods. The next question, obviously, so what? Like, are ultra processed foods actually a problem? What's so different about them? Here, there are a few nutritional theories and arguments that have been made. The first is that ultra processed foods are often nutritionally different than whole or lightly processed foods, namely that they are higher in saturated fats, added sugars, and sodium, while lower in fruits, vegetables, and fiber. So this makes sense. From a scientific perspective, the research on chronic disease is also quite clear. We want to consume fewer saturated fats, fewer added sugars and sodium to lower our disease risk. And we want to eat more fruits, vegetables, and fiber. So, just on a surface level, nutritionally speaking, it would seem that eating a lot of ultra processed foods might be a problem. The second argument is a little more nuanced, namely that ultra processed foods are often carbohydrate based. And what's more, they're a major source of acellular carbohydrates, aka carbs that have been liberated from the structure of their plant cell walls. Why would that matter? Well, eating ultra processed foods may be increasing the balance of rapidly digested carbohydrates in the diet, leading to chronic increases in blood sugars and potentially higher risk of type 2 diabetes. There is a lot of hate on carbs, but the reality is when we consume whole food carbohydrates, aka fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and legumes, they come wrapped in a tough, fibrous cell wall that takes time to break down, leading to a very different impact on blood sugars than a breakfast cereal so ultra processed that it practically melts on your tongue. The last argument that I want to explore in this episode is the assumption that because so many hyper-processed foods are designed to be what we call hyper-palatable, aka super freaking delicious, they may also promote overeating and contribute to our risk of obesity. I mean, when I say I bet you can't eat just one potato chip, like there is actually like a whole army of texture and flavor scientists engineering them to make that true. And if that last sentence piqued your interest, you might enjoy this oldie but goodie book called Sugar, Salt, Fat by Michael Moss. At this point, all of these arguments make logical and intuitive sense. But this wouldn't be the podcast it is unless we fact check it. So, what does the research actually say? Let's start with the nutritional content of ultra processed foods. In the research, ultra processed foods are associated with increased intake of energy, added sugars, total and saturated fats, as well as sodium, all nutrients we are told to be mindful of. Research also confirms that they tend to be lower in phytochemicals, fiber, fruits, and vegetables, dietary factors associated with positive health outcomes in the research. So, yep, while not all ultra processed foods fit into this pattern, many do. I hope in hearing this, though, a little crack appears in the UPFs are bad for you argument. Perhaps because many of these ultra processed foods have a less healthful nutrient profile, there might actually be a difference in consuming these types of UPFs as opposed to ones high in fiber, protein, or other beneficial nutrients like omega 3 fatty acids. So let's go deeper. I mentioned the idea of acellular carbohydrates earlier, so I want to explore this further, especially because it influences the discussions of blood sugar as well as weight. Plant cells are made of fiber, which by definition is challenging to break down. We do so both mechanically by chewing, but also chemically with the acids and digestive enzymes in our digestive system. As a result, and remember, this is something we want, we tend not to harness 100% of the nutrients and energy within a plant cell, as we will not break down 100% of the cells. I mean, all you need to do is think of the corn in your poop after a barbecue dinner to know that this is true. Because of this, undigested plant matter travels through the digestive tract where it can be fermented by our gut bacteria. This is important to remember. Whatever we do not digest and absorb interacts with and may be metabolized by our gut bacteria. If 100% digestion and absorption were possible, it would largely starve them out. So we're not trying to eat only, quote, easy to digest foods, unquote, okay? But when we ultra process foods, we release those nutrients from their cellular structure, dramatically increasing their bioavailability and usually lowering the undigestible fibers available to our gut microbiome. UPFs also shift the dietary balance away from fibrous carbohydrate and moderate biological amounts of fats and sugars to higher levels of added salt, fats, and sugars. all of which has an impact on our gut microbiome, which, let's be clear, your gut bacteria want you to eat a whole bunch of whole plants because that's the food supply they evolved with. And beyond the direct effects of nutrient composition of ultra-processed foods on our own cells, the effect on the microbiome is another indirect influence on our health. And it's possible that the shift to a diet high in UPFs could lead to inflammation via a microbiome link as well as a nutrient link. However, I also want to clarify what I see as a lot of overly confident information online about things like emulsifiers and artificial sweeteners and the microbiome. Much of the data we have suggesting that emulsifiers and sweeteners cause harm to our gut bugs comes from animal studies that don't necessarily hold true in humans, particularly because, for example, some emulsifiers in gums like lecithin or guar gum have been shown to be beneficial to the digestive tract. So I want to leave you with a caution that not all sweeteners and not all emulsifiers likely have the same impact either. And we are ways off from knowing whether or not these ingredients are detrimental in and of themselves, as opposed to being a symptom of UPF use. What's more, we're not rats. And in this kind of research, the exposures are often much higher than would be expected, even with a high intake of ultra-processed foods. So, let's not freak out that our almond milk has emulsifiers just yet, okay? So, now that we have talked a little more about how the structure of ultra processed foods might have a different effect on our metabolism, in theory, let's look at the research on diabetes and ultra processed food intake. Chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes do not happen overnight. Instead, what we see is a slow, under the radar evolution in our metabolism before something tips the scales into full blown disease. And for some, that's called metabolic syndrome, which is classified as a cluster of 5 symptoms, including high blood sugars, high levels of triglycerides, which is a blood fat associated with blood sugar control, low HDL or healthy cholesterol, as well as high blood pressure and increased waist circumference. Metabolic syndrome is associated with a 5-fold increase in type 2 diabetes risk and a doubled risk of cardiovascular disease. And one 2019 trial suggested that, particularly in younger adults, every 10% increase in UPFs increased risk of metabolic syndrome by 4% when adjusted for other variables such as fat or sugar intake. And an increase in UPF was also associated with increased saturated fat, sugar, and energy intake. So while the research rarely differentiates between nutrient-dense UPFs and standard UPFs, this study suggests that even when fat or sugar intake are the same, higher ultra-processed food intake might still be more detrimental. Why could this be? Let's talk carbohydrates, blood sugar response, and risk of weight gain. Very few of us in North America consume the majority of our carbohydrates in whole food form. We just don't. I'm talking rolled oats, wheat berries, quinoa, beans, and whole fruits and vegetables, as opposed to quinoa snack bars, juice, and coffee shop muffins. It's far more common to consume wheat as white flour as opposed to a wheat berry, which are delicious, by the way. And that refined white wheat flour, lacking in fiber and often cooked and extruded, such as shelf-stable pastries, super soft sandwich bread, breakfast cereals, or snack foods. And in doing so, the starches become more available to digestion, which can alter the glycemic response. Now, before I go further, I have to clarify a couple of things. The internet is absolutely rotten with quacks warning you about quote unquote glucose spikes from oatmeal or bananas. This is garbage. Your body was designed to consume carbohydrates, have your blood sugars rise, which is literally just your body delivering fuel to its cells, and then having your blood sugars fall again. However, eating fruit and oats is very different from the potential effects of making carbohydrate-forward UPFs the mainstay in your diet. Eating rapidly digested ultra-processed carbs will promote chronically high blood sugars and chronically high insulin levels in many people, which can encourage the deposition of fat in the liver, promote insulin resistance, and lead to the development of diabetes over time. We see this in the research on sugar-sweetened beverages, which are ultra-processed foods in a league of their own. They are strongly associated with an increased risk of diabetes in the research. Ultra-processed foods, in addition to their potential blood sugar effects, are also so easy to overeat, literally requiring less chewing and taking up less physical space in your stomach due to their low fiber content, which can affect your natural internal appetite regulation, meaning that you may eat more than you would if you were like eating wheat berries, for example. The quicker the food dissolves on your tongue, the quicker your stomach empties, the quicker your body is going to think it's hungry again, even if you've consumed adequate energy to technically last you until your next meal. So think lower fiber, lower volume, and less satiety or satisfaction. Great, again in theory, but what does the research say? I think there is a case, once again, for the dividing line between ultra processed foods themselves and the nutrients they contain. In one very well designed clinical trial, the only one that I've seen that actually fed people all their meals for 4 weeks, hunger and fullness between ultra processed meals and whole food meals actually did not differ significantly. However, all the meals were matched for both energy and satiating nutrients like protein and fiber. So, is it more important to eat whole foods, or that when you choose ultra processed foods, they are high in fiber, protein, and fats? This is where we need to focus some research in the future. And if you're interested in the topic of sugars and blood sugars specifically, I have a solo episode all about it in the archive, so you can dive much deeper than I'm able to go into here. So now let's talk about risk of obesity. If you're new to this podcast, I want to let you know that I have what is called a weight neutral practice, meaning that as a dietitian, I believe that a focus on healthy behaviors like eating vegetables or going for a walk and a healthy metabolism like keeping blood pressure low is more important for health than a number on the scale. But for this topic, I think it's important we cover obesity, as it is a huge part of the argument against ultra processed foods and understanding why obesity is seen at the rate it is in North America. The rise in availability of ultra processed foods has aligned with the rise in obesity. But remember, association does not always mean causation. There are many nutritional reasons for this that we've already mentioned, such as high rates of added sugars and fats and low fiber that makes these foods less filling. But something I need to mention here: much of the research we have suggesting dangers of UPF consumption have been observational, meaning that UPFs might be associated with a negative outcome like diabetes, but we can't say for sure that UPFs cause diabetes. We need to see outcomes of clinical trials to have a clearer picture of why and how, and to that end, I found a 2024 systematic review looking at only randomized controlled trials instead of observational data. And what the researchers found was that the trials where nutrition intervention was simply a bit of nutritional counseling to avoid UPFs, well, those ones had difficulty not only producing health changes, but also with study subjects actually following the advice. And as a dietitian, I know this and see this firsthand. I mean, if nutrition were as simple as like offering a handout or like 20 minutes of advice, none of us would have difficulty eating a nutritious diet. There are so many factors that influence our food choices, from our income to our food skills to how tired or stressed we are that day. Simply knowing that we should probably eat some broccoli really isn't enough. So, in this systematic review, in which there were also only 4 included studies, so not exactly super strong data, there was one controlled feeding trial, the gold standard of nutrition that I mentioned just a moment ago, and we'll revisit it now for a bit of nuance on the ultra processed foods and risk of obesity story. Because unlike studies where they teach you what to eat and then leave you to your own devices for like a month or 3 months or 6 months, in this study, the study subjects actually moved into the research center for 4 weeks so that the researchers could feed them all of their food. They ate an ultra processed diet for 2 weeks and then a mostly whole food diet for 2 more weeks. Both diets, as I mentioned, were matched for energy as well as the nutrients. And to get the fiber right, researchers added fiber to the drinks for the ultra processed arm. And in this study, the whole food diet did result in a lower intake of calories, fat, and carbohydrate, as well as lower cholesterol following the unprocessed diet, even though the diets were nutrient matched. Because they did a whole bunch of lab work too, researchers found that the hunger hormone ghrelin was decreased and the appetite suppressing hormone PYY was increased. So, on the unprocessed diet, this could have accounted for the lower energy intake because if you have less of the hunger hormone and more of the hormone sort of like keeping your appetite at bay, you might eat less of the food provided. Another theory on what happens when we eat ultra processed foods is that since they tend to be lower in protein, the protein leverage hypothesis might come into play. The protein leverage hypothesis states that if we have a biological drive to consume the protein we need, and if the foods we eat are low protein, we'll just keep eating, which can increase calorie consumption. This is just a theory, by the way, not like dyed in the wool scientific fact. But what researchers found in this study was interesting and in line with some of our theories, that there was a higher eating rate, literally how fast people consumed their calories with the UPF diet. So this could account for the higher energy intake they saw in the study because it does actually take a while for our body to realize it's full. Okay, so at this point in the research, we still have a lot of questions left unanswered. But the general theme is that, and you might be surprised to hear me say this if you've been around long enough, the discourse on ultra processed foods is one place where the internet appears mostly right. If the entirety of your diet comes from boxes, bags, and takeout, and you have the ability to change it, this is important. If you have the ability to change it, it is worth being very curious about how to increase the nutrient density of your overall diet, including from more nutrient dense processed foods and whole foods. In the research, there is an association between increasing intake of UPFs and increasing risk of dying from all causes, as well as even increased risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and even irritable bowel syndrome. But notice, if you were paying attention, that I said the internet appears mostly right. So it's not entirely accurate when an influencer says that UPFs are toxic or inflammatory or bad for you. Without a doubt, so many of the most difficult to shift nutrition beliefs spawned online come with at least a kernel of scientific truth, but then it gets blown way out of proportion. Because as you've seen, there is a way more nuanced discussion here. The first and most obvious being that not all ultra processed foods are, in fact, high in saturated fats, added sugars, and salt, and that some of them may even be high in nutrients we're trying to eat more of. Like for me, a protein powder that helps me add 20 grams of protein and 5 grams of fiber to my morning smoothie. Isn't that a good thing? Yeah, I think it is. Not essential, but certainly helpful. Or an unsweetened soy milk that gives you the same amount of calcium or protein as dairy milk when you're vegan or have a dairy allergy. That is also a very good thing. So for me as a dietitian, I think we cannot evaluate UPFs merely by the fact of them being an ultra processed food. We need to be curious about their actual nutritional content and whether they add positives or challenges to our everyday diet. And as we get into the so what do I do with this information portion of the podcast, I also feel the need to clarify that not every single food you place in your mouth needs to be whole and nutrient dense. Like you can eat an Oreo after a black bean chili, and the Oreo is not some magic eraser that negates all of the nutrition you took in, okay? You're allowed to eat food for just pure enjoyment or culture or connection. It's totally fine. If you've been here a while, you know what I'm going to say. Pattern over plate. What you do most of the time determines your health far more than what you do a little bit of. I love me a Coke Zero every once in a while. And there's literally no reason from an evidence-backed health perspective why that needs to change. The next conversation we need to have is about the rather elitist and irrational views on ultra-processed foods you're going to encounter online. There are innumerable influencers and even some health professionals that will tell you it's harmful to consume UPFs like oat milk or breakfast cereal on one hand, either because of the A, ultra processing itself, or B, the presence of some ingredient they've deemed quote unquote toxic or inflammatory, like seed oils, emulsifiers, or regular old sugar. And if it's the latter, typically what they're going to come through with is another ultra processed food with quote unquote cleaner ingredients like avocado oil, coconut sugar, or it's something gluten free. But I hate to break it to you, a potato chip is still a potato chip that is deep fried and covered in salt. Sugar is sugar, whether you get that sugar from sugarcane, coconut sap, or the maple tree. A scoop of dehydrated vegetable powder is not the same thing as eating an actual vegetable. It's just not. The internet is actually highly accepting of ultra processed foods as long as it has a perceived wellness benefits such as greens powders, protein powders, or superfood snacks. Do I also need to point out that there is a huge cost discrepancy between these products? Essentially, these elite wellness proponents are saying, well, if you can't afford this $10 box of cereal, then too bad your $4 ultra processed one is making you sick, which is so messed up, it would take me a whole other podcast to unpack. A parallel conversation about ultra processed foods and health outcomes is connected to the availability and affordability of UPFs and the multiple ways that non nutrient factors such as food skills, income level, stress level, access to healthcare, and safe outdoor spaces all influence someone's health, independent of what they are putting in their mouth. When your food budget is limited, the most important thing is gaining adequate access to food to feed yourself and your family. Getting adequate food in and of itself is critical to supporting health and wellness, even if it's shelf stable ultra processed food. Fed is best. It was noted in a paper by Hall that overwhelmingly it is more expensive to feed your family an unprocessed diet than an ultra processed one. In order to feed 2,000 calories a day, the weekly grocery cost was 106 US dollars for ultra processed foods and 151 for unprocessed. And this study was published in 2020. Food costs have risen significantly since then. In a 2025 study, it was found that people with incomes closer to the poverty line had an increased intake of ultra processed food over time versus people with higher income levels. This just makes sense because they're less expensive. And if we're truly serious about improving the health of our communities, then we need to be active in supporting living wages, low barrier access to healthy foods, and supporting local food systems financially so more people can afford to buy fruits and vegetables for their family. We should be advocating for increased subsidies for local farmers who grow fruits and vegetables, as opposed to the industrial farms that feed the ultra processed food system and ensure access to those fruits and vegetables for low income families who live in food deserts. Demonizing seed oils isn't actually helping anyone, aside from the folks who make money producing seed oil free ultra processed foods and the influencers with their discount codes. If the idea of social determinants of health are new to you, I've got some links in the show notes to help introduce the concept because, spoiler alert, the number one risk factor for being healthy is not eating fruits and vegetables, it's having money. Okay. So once we've talked about this basic level of nutrition and we can meet that for ourselves and our family, now we can start to talk about making choices within categories of foods such as lower sugar, higher fiber breads and breakfast cereals, for example. We can add brand buds to our favorite breakfast cereal to up the fiber while keeping the enjoyment. We can add a piece of fruit to our afternoon snack. And we can try and make half our plate vegetables at dinner to increase our whole food intake. These things can all be done without too much mental burden on changing your diet. Okay. At this point, I think we've covered the theoretical and scientific discussion. So now comes the well, what do I do with this information in my actual life portion of the program? I hope that at least on a macro level, it's clear that A, not all ultra processed foods can be painted with the same brush, and B, it's also okay to have some totally non nutritional UPFs in your diet. The presence of ultra processed foods in your diet isn't going to make you sick automatically. The key here is, say it again, pattern over plate. Of course it is. My advice, try to eat as many whole and minimally processed foods as you can afford, have the time and ability to cook. Figure out how to make them so delicious you love eating them. You can grab free recipes on my website or borrow one of my 3 cookbooks from your library. And if you're like, I need some harder metrics than that, consider the 80-20 rule. It's a classic for a reason. If 80% of your choices are nutrient dense, your body should be healthy and resilient enough to sail through the 20% that aren't. You can break that up on a daily or a weekly basis, depending if you're someone who loves a little daily treat or someone who just wants 2 to 3 meals a week to be nothing but pure joy. If your diet looks closer to 50-50, don't worry. Know that every shift you make towards 80-20 is a win. You do not have to do this overnight. Instead, play the long game of making small changes that become so automatic that over time, you get healthier. Enjoy ultra-processed foods where they make eating well more convenient, more affordable, and more enjoyable. Look for options that are higher in fiber, lower in added salt, sugar, and saturated fat to keep them more nutritionally dense. Like I said, this could be a high fiber breakfast cereal like Raisin Bran Elite, or a plant based burger that offers 20 grams of protein and is way more filling than one made with just vegetables, in my opinion. I'm going to go out on a limb here, but like I love me a Beyond Burger, I'm going to get my vegetables on the side. And no, quote unquote, cleaner snacks aren't the same as whole foods either. Like, I love these little chickpea based vegan cheese puffs called hippies, but not for 1 second do I think they're as nutrient dense as eating chickpeas. They're just salty snacks for movie night. So I think we're ready for the community question now, don't you? Here goes. What is the impact of these ultra processed foods that use health halo statements like seed oil free? This one is so good on so many levels. Okay. Because we've talked about this a bit already, but let's consider it a bit more holistically because marketing messes with us all the time. For example, avocado oil potato chips. When we see avocado oil or seed oil free on the package, we may incorrectly feel like these chips are a health food and therefore something we can consume as freely as we do vegetables. But while I love me a potato chip, it is still a deep fried food with little in the way of fiber, protein, or vitamins or minerals. Like, I don't think for 1 second it's a health food. It's just delicious. So, this kind of health halo marketing can really mess with our perception of which foods we should eat more of or less of by inference. What's more, including or excluding an ingredient often doesn't change the blood sugar impact or the satiety or eating rate of these UPFs. For example, a puffy food like my beloved hippie snacks are still extremely easy to eat the whole bag, even though they do actually have a bit more fiber and protein than a typical potato chip. A protein bar made from quote unquote clean grass fed protein still doesn't have any fruits and vegetables. So if you don't add some, you're going to be missing out on the research verified benefits of eating them. And these foods still reinforce eating behaviors towards UPFs and away from whole foods. Like, it is not uncommon for me to see folks, particularly in this protein mania we're living through, thinking that they're eating healthfully when in reality they're just eating like meat and ultra processed foods, but with ingredients they consider clean. So absolutely buy the ultra processed foods you can afford and enjoy. Like, many of these like quote unquote better for you products come from smaller independent businesses, and that is absolutely a win. But remember, the focus for health will always be to eat as many whole foods as you are able. And then secondarily, to choose processed foods that are more nutrient dense with actual fiber, protein, or fruit than simply swapping canola oil for avocado oil. Okay, friends, there you have it. Everything you could ever possibly need to know about ultra processed foods in less than 45 minutes. And if you love the nerdy nutrition stuff, go back and check out my other solo nutrition episodes on sugar, protein, and inflammation, which is the most popular solo episode I've ever done. And be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Allsorts podcast, which is produced by myself and edited by Brian McCalman. We are grateful to live and work on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Until next time, friends, be well.